All right. Well, thank you for the introduction. And as you mentioned, this is a recording in a series or a web session in a series of three. Today, we'll primarily be talking about processes and how that actually also relates a bit to compliance. Next time we'll talk about compliance and beyond compliance. The elements around documents and data we've addressed last time. There's a recording available if you're interested in it. But just to actually roll back to what we said last time about the data, I just want to quickly give you a short introduction also in case you weren't able to meet it or to participate in that previous session here. If you look at what is happening today, there is a lot of demand for structured data coming your way. There's a lot of information being digitized. There's a lot of information, structured data being requested. There are elements around SPOR, SPL, these are IDMP related initiatives that are there. So there's a lot of elements, but it's not just about European and the FDA that work about it, but there's also several other things like Brazil, Canada, Switzerland are also looking into IDMP. IDMP, we'll talk about it in a second what it is. There's also a lot of acronyms that you need to be aware of. IDMP is one of the main ones because that's what we're basing our standard on, and that's what we'll be talking about it, which processes do you need to build, what processes do you need to take care of, or what do you need to take care in your process with respect to an ISO-IDMP implementation. You will also see elements like DADI, XEVMPD, electronic application forms. So you really see that there's so many initiatives going on for the moment that you could actually lose track of what is actually happening. Right? But the point is essentially is that the first question you need to ask yourself is, why are you doing all of this? So why are we doing this? And the best scenario that I could actually see is a slide from the EMA that I found a couple of years back, which actually illustrates very clearly what the regulators are doing and what you could actually mirror within your organization also. Well, if I look at this slide, what the implementation of ISO-IDMP at the EMA was essentially around making sure that you have an end-to-end product lifecycle, that you could manage your end-to-end product lifecycle. All the way from the moment that you had your very phase 1 clinical trial, marketing, till the end of life. Because if you really look at it from a perspective of where the challenge is, authorities are essentially responsible for the benefits, but also for the patient safety when you're actually building your products. And this has not always been very easily at regulators, especially when data is exchanged through documents. Different terminologies exist in clinical than they are in marketed products and everything. So it became very difficult, and it is very difficult based on that to actually find signals and do data assessments across different departments. So the overall strategy, which is being depicted here by the EMA, was to make sure that well, let's use an international standard like ISO-IDMP around products, and let's make sure that is, I wouldn't say implemented, but actually used across the board in all of those domains. So that you actually can link every aspect of your element, whether it's a clinical trial, whether it's a batch, whether it's a marketing authorization, that you can bring it back to a common definition of a product. Now, that essentially, if you look at this and if you think about it, what the regulators are doing, you can easily do within your organization. So within your organization, you also have those departments that communicate. So if the authority is looking at your end-to-end process, it is something that you could consider also doing within your organization. And as I said, today, what we want to talk about is that process aspect. Is how do you go about, if you set up such an IDMP program, what processes do play a role into this? But before I go into the processes, a summary from last session, when it comes to the data session, a summary that we had was, we talked about building a central repository, where you have your data, and that data, product data or master data that you want to have, and how that data can actually be collected was one thing, is how can we get it in there? How can you make sure it's accurate, correct? How we can make sure that it's timely, but also so that it can actually be used in both compliance needs, external needs as well as your internal needs. Yeah. So again, we're not going to go into more details. That was actually the topic of last week's presentation. And today we want to actually start looking at some of those processes. Yeah. What are the processes and how can you actually make sure that those processes are clearly aligned within your organization? Yeah. And I want to look at two types of processes. I want to look at, and they are dependent but also independent. And the first thing I want to look at is on the right side of this diagram. It's really about compliance needs. Yeah? What are the processes that you have to put in place? What can you think about putting in place with respect to compliance? And specifically, I'm focusing here on the EAF or the DADI process that essentially the EMA has published, and that will become mandatory in the near future to be followed also. Yeah? In the second part of the presentation, I want to talk more about considerations around your internal needs. Yeah? Internal business processes. How do you manage those things going forward also? Yeah, because of course the data is one element, yeah, but you have to make sure that you have the right process in place also to make sure that not the data is collected once, but that the data also remains over time valid and up to date. Yeah. Now, I also talk about two separate sections within the presentation: compliance and business needs. And you will see they're very clearly separated, but that's also one of the benefits that you have with the central repository. Yeah, I also mentioned that last week, yeah, where I said by building a central repository, one of the strong benefits of that is that you can actually keep all of your sub-processes completely separate. You can build a DADI project, you can build an XEVMPD process without impacting your internal business processes. So it's actually a very beneficial element with respect to this particular solution, that both processes can be completely separated. As I said, in the first instance, I want to focus a little bit on compliance. Yeah? This is obviously also one of the key needs, of course. You have to be compliant with the regulations. And of course, this is also one of the things which is happening nowadays, because this is really where the EMA has been focusing on. And I will not go through the whole iteration of the last couple of years about how it evolved, yeah, how it evolved that particular thing. What I want to do is I really want to focus on the DADI process and what you will have to be doing according to what the EMA has currently published. Yeah. But before I go to, as I said, I don't want to look at history, but I do want to go back to what is one of your operational processes that you have today, or that you should have today. That's XEVMPD. Yeah. Your XEVMPD process. And the reason why I put this on here is that if I talk about DADI in a second and what will happen there, yeah, is that you will have to realize that the process is going to be slightly different. Yeah? Different in one way, but also have to realize that because DADI is, it's not because you implement DADI that XEVMPD is also going to go away. I think that's a very important lesson to learn already, or a very important takeaway at this point in time, is the fact that it's not the case that if you implement DADI, that XEVMPD will completely go away. Yeah. So make sure that you keep that in mind also when you put at your process, when you look at your IDMP and your compliance aspect of your IDMP project. I think how XEVMPD works is very clear. It basically goes through the steps here. It's you submit the information. So you basically, so the first few steps are all related to your regulatory submission process. They're nothing to do with XEVMPD. So XEVMPD is actually a post-approval activity that you need to do. As soon as you get approval, you will basically have to submit an XEVMPD record to your Article 57 database. It gets processed. There is a whole cycle here that I didn't represent here because I didn't want to go to that level of detail, but you do get acknowledgements. You do get acknowledgement 1, 2, and 3 back. You get an MDM back, acknowledgement 2 and acknowledgement 3. So even XEVMPD has a whole cycle related to this. Yeah? It also, of course, depends on whether you do this process manually by entering it on the website, on the portal, yeah, or whether you use systems to actually submit it to a gateway. Yeah. But again, this process is not going to go away, right? Keep in mind that even if you have something, that the transition will be there. Yeah. And I would even say if you don't have it in place today, or I have to say correctly, if you don't have an electronic process in place today, yeah, it's still worth considering based on the previous slide with the central repository, to invest in an XEVMPD solution, because as I said, it doesn't go away either. Yeah. But now let's shift gears a little bit and see the DADI project, or the EAF that is being done now. Is what is going to happen, or what is the EMA requesting now? Yeah. And the process is going to be a little bit more complicated, because what they're actually going to do, and you look at the left bottom part, when you're looking at the PMS database, yeah. So this database, by the way, is being filled, and you don't have to do anything around this. This is something that the authorities take care of. They've migrated the Article 57 database, or they integrated the Article 57 database into the PMS database. Yeah, or the data will go there. There's a few other data sources that go in there, but you don't have to resubmit your PMS data. Yeah, which is a good thing, because you don't, everything that you're doing for XEVMPD is not a waste. Yeah, so at least that's a good thing also. But what you will need to do going forward is essentially say, look, when you're doing a submission, so you see here, when you're doing the initial submission, the focus is shifting from the post-approval activities with XEVMPD to pre-submission activities already, because what you will need to do is the EAF form, the electronic application form, is being adopted or adapted or changed essentially to make sure that it will use the PMS database. Yeah. Keep in mind also this process, not explicitly mentioned here, but in first glance, this process is only required for variations. Yeah. So when you do variations, this you will need to follow. This initial submission will still follow, until further notice, of course, the XEVMPD process to populate the PMS database. Yeah. What you will have to do is you will have to go into your EAF form, into your DADI form, where you enter the information, something that is already available today, and it will pull the PMS data. So you'll select your product, and it will say, this is the data that I know about your product. Yeah. Keep in mind, we're only looking at it from a variations perspective. Yeah. So it'll pull the data from the PMS for your product that you submitted before. And then there is two ways. Either this is wrong, or you see corrections that are needed. Yeah. And this is purely wrong data. Yeah. I mean, if the data in the PMS database is wrong, not if you want to make a change. If you want to make a shelf life change, of course, it's going to show you the old one, and you'll have to give the new one. But if the data is incorrect, you will still have to go and do a correction in the Article 57 database through XEVMPD submission. And then the data in your PMS will be updated, and your DADI process will be updated. So this is a way actually also of a quality check of the PMS data, yeah, to make sure that you're in alignment with that. I still have a few technical questions on that also myself, but I'm not going to go into details on that, especially related to acknowledgement 3 and so on. But anyway, we'll not deviating too much to the details of this process. That's maybe something that could be covered if you ever decide to engage a company in the assessment of your project. You will update the DADI forms. You will download the PDF together with the FHIR message. You will include that in your ECTD sequence that you submit, and you will actually do the submission of your project. At the end of the submission, you'll have to still have to do an XEVMPD submission in that, and then Article 57. So it's actually a loop. Yeah, an XEVMPD and DADI are very closely involved, but the key message here is that you get your data. You get your changes in a structured format earlier in the process. Yeah. Hopefully over time, some things will go away also. Yeah. Hopefully over time, when they also do initial submissions and they start leveraging fully on the FHIR message and lesser on the XEVMPD message, this diagram will also change. Yeah. So hopefully over time, this will completely be modified also. So keep tuned on how this evolves. Yeah. However, there are still a few things which are unclear. Is, for instance, if you do questions, describe the fact that if you do an EAF form that you have to include it in your sequence. It's not explicitly mentioned, as far as I've seen it at least, that if you have questions and you have to resubmit, or you have to do a second sequence or a new intermediate sequence, whether you still have to do this EAF. Yeah. And there is also but that's more of an internal at the EMA. A second question mark is that FHIR message, why could that not update the PMS database directly? I mean, that's more internal coding at the EMA, and maybe this is coming, because if whatever you enter in the FHIR message in the EAF form, if that could automatically be uploaded in the PMS database, technically speaking, there is no need for XCV-MPD anymore, although keep in mind also that it's not 100%, at least for iteration 1. But I think the evolution is going to be that this XCV-MPD hopefully will go away, and that the more that you can enter your data at the very beginning of your stage, and that also goes into your PMS database. But that's again future. Those are two future elements. The process for iteration 1 is very simple, very clean. You enter your data up front, you put it in your eCTD, and you follow your submissions. Finally, then also to do your XCV-MPD submission. Yeah. Now, this is from a regulatory perspective. I also just want to look at it from a perspective of internally. The main challenge that I see, and if we put our central repository into the mix here, yeah, the one thing that I'm a bit worrying about, or not worrying, it goes a bit further, is the fact that as a company you will still have to do double data entry. Yeah, there is no way to upload your data from your central repository directly into the EAF form or into your PMS database. So there is still 2 manual processes that you have to follow. You have to update your EAF form. You'll have to update your central repository, or if, of course, the data comes from your RIM system into the central repository, update the data in your RIM system. So you will have a period where you will have to do double data entry. So really where I would like to take a side step here on the regulatory process is some opportunities that I also see short term even to think about, could you leverage on that PDF and that fire message, yeah? To actually upload that directly into your central repository. Yeah? If you say, look, the double data entry is not that much work. Yeah. If you only have like a variation every week or so, could easily be done, could easily be manageable or managed that you have double data entry. So not a problem there. On the other hand, if you have too many things, you might actually consider investing and looking into whether the downloaded message, the fire message that you download from your from the EAF, whether you could import that into your central repository also, or into your RIM system and then into your central repository. That has to be seen on what your preference is. Yeah. So essentially, there could be some efficiency gains here also, basically leveraging on what the EMA provides here. Yeah. Of course, in the future, you can also look at uploading that. Hopefully, there'll be an opportunity also where you can generate your own PDF and fire message. So step 2 onto this one, that you enter the data in your RIMS or central repository, and that you can generate automatically your EAF or your fire message and include that into your, without actually having to go to the web portal. Again, future considerations here, maybe thinking too far ahead, but I do know that the EMA is probably also looking at these kind of capabilities to have that opportunity to actually automate business processes also at your end. Yeah. So really what the summary here essentially talking about, the compliance aspect of it is, this is moving. Yeah, you will have to adopt to it, and essentially your processes that you build around it, you have to, and the solutions you build around it will also have to be adaptable. Yeah, you will have to do it the same way that the EMA is evolving over time. Yeah, and the EMA has clearly stated that they're taking an agile approach to this. They're only talking about variations now going this way, not about the initial submission. So you see, they will be evolving over time also. Yeah. So the key takeaway from this is, yes, be compliant, definitely. Yeah. Understand what you need to do, but also make sure that whatever you put in place, think about how could I leverage on some of the data, like for instance, what is shown here immediately. Yeah. What can I bring automatically to the table in one hand? And how can I make my solution future-proof here also, with respect, knowing again that the EMA will take an agile approach. So variations phase 1. Yeah. Who knows, maybe next step will be, okay, we've added this capability into it, make sure that you can start using this. Yeah. So be flexible, be compliant, but also be flexible in the solution that you've actually built. Yeah. So that's about the first part of the presentation, talking about your compliance needs, your compliance processes, and how you can actually build that. As I said, the second part of the presentation, I really want to think about internal processes, internal needs that you might have, and how do you address this? Where do you need to be careful about this? Yeah. Last week, we talked about bringing data in. Yeah, we talked about elements around is doing assessment around how complete is your data, how accurate is your data. Yeah, is it consistent? Is it timely? You basically put data ownership elements in place. Yeah. So we basically talked about that piece, and we talked about what can you do on the data side. What we want to do today is really start looking at, okay, what can you do on the process side? Yeah, and where do you need to be careful on the process side? And what are some considerations when you're looking at your internal processes? Yeah. I think some of the questions that you now need to ask up front here is that, of course, there are the what, when, who, the quality that you need to build in, how are we going to do it in governance. You need to think about all of those aspects when you're building your end-to-end process. Yeah? But at the beginning, you really need to think about, and this is still a bit of a piece about the data. Yeah, it's what is needed, who can supply me this information, is it complete, accurate, and consistent? So what technologies can I use? Yeah, so those are all questions that we've asked last week in the data session. Yeah, but of course you can't look data and process separately. Yeah, so if you haven't had a chance, or if you were unable to participate in this previous session, I would recommend that you really also have a look at it and see how those two are actually related to each other. Yeah, but now let's focus on the process. Yeah, so where do you start that process? Yeah, when you're doing your evaluation and you're looking at that process, well, I would recommend the first thing that you do is define what the needs are. Yeah, build your true end-to-end process. And this is where I would actually recommend to say, build a blue sky scenario. Yeah. What time frame do you need it in? What do you need? What time frame in? What business cases do you, or use cases do you want to have? Yeah. And I would always recommend to start thinking from a blue sky or the ideal solution. Yeah. I know a lot of companies have started from a sense and said, okay, well, let's jump into it directly and let's see what we have. Yeah. And build around that. But my experience has also been that if you don't want to, if you start from what you have completely, then you will never reach an ideal scenario. You will never get to a stage where it can be efficient because you get trapped into your current processes very quickly. It doesn't mean, by the way, that you have to build your blue sky. Yeah, it's still blue sky. You want to aim for that. You want to reach that. Yeah, you can make compromises here and there. Yeah, but at least you start from a top layer going down rather than from the bottom trying to get up. Yeah, so that is really a very important aspect, I would say, is when you're building that particular processes in place. Yeah, start looking from what is the ideal scenario, and then see how can you get to that scenario, and if necessary, you can downgrade it, of course, also. Then the next step that you would do is understand your own as-is process situation. Yeah, what do we already have in place? So really, and I'm talking about your own, I mean here regulatory. Regulatory will probably be the main driver for that. So I think the first thing that you need to do is really look at your regulatory processes. Yeah, what do you have in place? Does it exist? What KPIs do we have? Is our data, where does our data come from? Yeah. Is everybody following the process? So it's really more an introspection that you would have to do within your regulatory department. Yeah. Are we using quality checks within our data? And maybe with some touches towards external data, yeah, or external sources. You can, of course, start bringing those in. Yeah. But first identify, yeah, what is working within your organization, what is not working within your regulatory organization. Yeah, because keep in mind, regulatory will be the key supplier of the ISO-IDMP data. Yeah, so look at it first and say what works, what doesn't work, where could we make improvements, and then when you've identified those improvements, you can ask the question is, okay, but who can help me with those improvements? Yeah, am I doing manual data entry for the moment? Yeah, does another source give me the information and do I enter it manually? Yeah, or do I have a gap here in my data that can actually be supplied by another department? Yeah, so you can always start asking the question is, who can fill the gaps, but also who can make my process more efficient? Yeah, so if I say, look, I'm doing a manually entry for the moment from the document which is being sent by clinical, for instance, yeah, ask the question and say, okay, can I automate this? Yeah, not just automate with NLP or a process where I take the document into data. into my regulatory system, but even go a step further and say, well, where does clinical get this data from? Yeah, where does clinical get the data? Do they have a database that they create a document that they give to me that I need to put in data again? Yeah, is it data to document to data? If that's the case, why don't you just consider data to data? Yeah. So when you're actually starting to talk about looking at other departments, yeah, is there already a process in place? That's probably the first point that you will start looking at to say, how do we exchange data now? As I said, I just gave you the example of clinical and regulatory, how you exchange that data. Yeah, but you can do that for anything, right? Is there a process in place? Maybe there's even already a technology integration, which actually would be a step further than just the data exchange through documents. Yeah. When you then start looking at other sources, I think it's also important to understand the process at source. Yeah. It does go a little bit further in a sense of saying, look, don't take for granted what the source is. And I know this is sometimes very difficult. If you go to another department and you say, look, is your data accurate? Is everything reliable? Are you getting everything in the system in time? Nobody wants to hear another department challenge them. Yeah. But of course, it has to be done, because if you want to be compliant at the end, if the data from that source is going to go into your central repository, yeah, you have to make sure that you get that accurate data. So you have to ask those questions. Yeah, how hard or painful they also might be. Yeah. The other thing that you have to make sure, or what my experience has brought also, is create awareness at the source. Yeah. So when you're building those processes and when you're thinking about, okay, I want to bring this data across and I want to these transformations and I want to this and I want to build this end-to-end process, either manual or either a paper-based process or a technical process, make sure that your source already aware what it is for. Yeah. But at the same time, yeah, and that is the last point here, is do not try to force those changes. Make sure that the source that you provide also has benefits to it. Yeah, might have mentioned this before already. You have to be on the edge here, yeah, on the edge of a sword here, by saying, look, you want to get your data, you want to get your quality data. Yeah, you don't want to offend them by saying they don't have quality data, but at the same time, you want to make sure that the solution and the processes that you put in place are future-proof. Yeah. If they are not future-proof, you're absolutely not going to get the data that you want. You might get it once, you might get it for a couple of months, but it is not future-proof. So that's really where it's also important to start on making sure that they are aware of what IDMP is, what it benefits, and what benefits it could give them. What data can they get from the source, yeah, from the central source of information that can make their business process easier. Yeah? It sounds logical, and I'm sure everybody's sitting there and say, yeah, that's all logical, but it's amazing to see how many companies don't forget that, because there is so much pressure in building that IDMP compliant solution that sometimes this is forgotten also. So make sure that you build that into your processes also. Yeah. The last point that I want to make here also is, indeed, don't force the changes. I think you have to, yes, bring the benefits in place also, but also think about downstream corrections that you can do. If I think about an example of transformations where terminology alignment or so, this is something that you could also do downstream. You know, you don't have to force people to start using an OMS or an RMS library or dictionary or code list. Yeah? These are things that you can easily also downstream figure out. Although don't try to do everything downstream, because if you do everything downstream, you put a lot of emphasis or a lot of effort there, yeah, in doing cleanup in the middle, yeah, and you lose some of the efficiencies and the benefits that you have also, yeah. So again, look at your own sources, but when you're talking about external sources, think about what processes do you have, how can I get them involved, what benefits can I give them, and how can I make changes? How can I balance out the changes that I expect from the source to be made also? Yeah. The next step in the process is around quality, and this is probably also one of the biggest things, yeah, that you need to think about is really, it's a little bit, this step is a little bit difficult to say, is this a data check or a process check? Yeah, but of course, it's all about data. Yeah, it's about compliance, accurate and consistent data that you have. But I would also say is that when you look at it, is think about processes, putting processes in place. Put cleanup processes in place, but just cleaning up the data for once is not good. If you clean up the data, if you have a process or a policy to clean up the data, that's a one-time effort. Yeah, you have to have a long-term process in place also. Yeah, that makes sure that the errors that you identified don't come back. So think about that also to say, look, yeah, we have a cleanup process, but also what can we do to make sure that it doesn't happen again? Yeah. You also need to put quality checks in place. Yeah. You have to ensure that, yes, you can put a process in place. Yeah. That consists of data quality. Yeah. But make sure that you also have a process in place that checks that quality on a regular basis. Yeah. If you put certain KPIs on the source with respect to timeliness, quality, accuracy, completeness, make sure that you also think about putting checks in place that check this on a regular basis when you're actually in production. Yeah. So monitor the processes. I think that's also very important. It comes back into the compliance aspects also, and later on we'll talk about that also. But this is really an aspect also that is very important. Yeah. And as I said also on the previous slide, with respect to that remediation, yeah, if the data is not correct at the source, yeah, think about whether you can do it downstream. You know, you can do it at source, you can do it during the transfer, at the destination, namely your central repository, or you could combine it with other sources, and whatever is missing in one source, you can get it from another source. So there's a lot of considerations here when it comes to data quality that you need to make. But you also realize that what I mentioned just now also is that if you go downstream, and if you do, the further you go downstream, yeah, in correcting some of those problems, those quality problems, the further you are away from your ideal solution. Yeah, could be a temporary solution, and if you put those things in place, yeah, as a temporary solution, also make sure that you have a roadmap or a plan in place to remediate that over time. Yeah, if it can't happen today, yes, you can do it downstream. You can do it in your data central, clean up the data, but it cannot become a final process. Yeah, there has to be some sort of a commitment to actually bring it upstream again, to bring upstream that data quality corrections also. But sometimes you have to compromise in the area of making that that compliance happen over time also. Yeah. Final point is technology. How do you do this, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about where can I get the data? What can we do to make sure that the process works? What can I do within my implementation process to make that particular work? What considerations do I have? Well, the how is actually also very important on that, yeah, and not from a technology point of view. We talked about that last week also, yeah, but also look at it from is a technical integration possible? Yeah? Is that even possible? And if so, how do we do this? Yeah? So there is also a lot of things that will happen is through APIs, web services, but even if you bring in the data in, there is still that outer layer is the technical layer that you can see on the diagram. The inner layer is actually talking about data remediations that might have to happen within your data repository. Yeah, you're never going to get the source data completely the way you want it. You'll have to do some merging of data, splitting of data in certain areas. You might have to do some mappings of code lists with, as I said, OMS, RMS. Yeah, so it's very important also that around that central repository that you put data processes around. Yeah, you can do that either technically or in the written process. Yeah, but you have to make sure that you clearly identify what data is coming in. Yeah, who are the data stewards for that particular data? Who's going to clean that data? How are we going to resolve those distinguishes or these differences so that it basically can essentially also work for other departments. Yeah. So these are very important. We're talking about the technology layer. Yeah. And a lot of people then step away and say, well, this is pure technology. Yeah. But it isn't. There is still that business process layer in the middle, which will actually play an important role. Yeah. And hopefully over time, when you actually disseminate the quality towards the source systems. Yeah, so when you go away from your central repository and you actually get the data quality that you want into your source systems, yeah, that layer, that intermediate layer around your central repository will go away or will diminish. I don't think it'll ever go completely away, but it will diminish over time, the responsibilities that are put on there. But be aware that definitely in the beginning, yeah, there'll be a lot of efforts that will need to be put into this. Yeah, and here the experience that somebody might have with other departments and other companies could actually be very beneficial also to engage an external party to actually look into this and actually share some of the challenges that have been faced. Yeah. And by the way, these are all things for both inbound as well as outbound data, right? I mean, we're talking specifically here, but a lot of my examples are focused towards inbound into the data repository, into your central repository. Yeah, but obviously also you have to do. Also, you can look at the same things from an going externally. Yeah, so if any department says, "Look, I want to receive data from your central repository," yeah, there's also, of course, all of those things that will need to happen. You might have to merge data, you might have to split data, you might have to map data to make it work for your destination from that sense also. Yeah. So really, that element is also very important related to internal as well as external data. Yeah. Now, the final step into this process is essentially around governance. Yeah. The initial process, your IDMP project will not, it's hard to say it will not go away, but over time it will transform. Yeah. It will be very much focused at the beginning towards data collection, data assessments. Then from data assessments, it goes to processes. Which processes do you need to put in place to make sure that everything happens? The integrations will happen. But also the governance at the end is a very important aspect. Yeah, is how do you govern your data and how do you make sure that what you have in place actually stays in an appropriate way? Yeah, how can you make sure that it basically is whatever you put the effort you put in today, whether 5 years from now, 10 years from now, is still accurate, and that essentially you can still keep on submitting your IDMP data to your regulators. Yeah. So from that one, from governance, I think some of the governance aspects, some of them I already mentioned in the presentation. They're again straightforward also, but if you want to have a clear, long-standing, future-proof governance, the first thing you need to do is get the buy-in from the source departments. I mentioned this a few times and I can only keep on repeating it. What I've seen is that these projects are only successful if you only get the sources on board. Yeah. Afterwards, the attention will diminish over time. You will not get the data you want. Quality will go down. Compliance will go down, and you create your own risk for your company. Yeah. Yeah. So it's not just a matter of one time, but over time, governance processes have to be put in place also. KPIs, I mentioned that already also. KPIs where you track on a regular basis. I mean, it's the general concept of quality checks, quality control is essentially to monitor things are happening. Yeah, put also KPIs in place. Yeah, put upfront, agree upfront what those KPIs are. Don't try to do it afterwards. Don't try to do it when you have problems. Yeah, or when you see the quality of the data going down. Agree upfront what those KPIs are and monitor them. Yeah, put monitoring in place. To either technical monitoring is definitely possible. In certain areas, you want to do manual data checks and so on. It comes back to your data stewards and data monitors that you have within your organization. But I would highly recommend that you look at those things up front. Don't try to do it afterwards because then you have all discussions about what it should be, but agree with your source department what they can provide in what time frame and make an assessments whether it makes sense or not, and whether it's what you actually need to ensure compliance for your department, but more importantly, for your whole organization. Yeah. And I would also, something which is always forgotten is an escalation process. Make sure if it doesn't happen where you need to go. The last thing you want to do is, if it doesn't work 5 years down the road, that you basically don't know where to go, and that you have to start building awareness everywhere again, and are unable to build your process or solve your problem. Yeah, you really need to build that escalation progress and get buy-in from different people here also. Yeah. So again, very important that you build your processes to bring the data in. Yeah, processes to move the data, but also governance, quality checks, controls. And again, this falls within the category of when you hear it, it makes sense. Yeah, and I'm not telling you anything new, hopefully, but it is something that is often forgotten. In the heat of the moment, and in the heat of the timelines that need to be built and everything, sometimes those things crop up, and it's by not doing these, you're just going to get yourself into more trouble down the road also. So don't forget about these things is really the main message. They make sense, but don't forget about them. So really, finally, to conclude on this particular session, with respect to two aspects of it. Yeah, as I said, the first axis is the regulatory process. It's mostly defined by the authorities, and you have to follow it. Yeah, but you have to follow it, the process and the timelines. Make sure that others also understand that. Yeah, especially if you get the data from your other sources. We can build a solution which is flexible. I think that's really when I look at the regulatory processes, and if you look at how IDMP at the EMA has evolved over the last, I think, 4, 5, 6 years, yeah, where it originally started to XCVMPD to where DADI is now, and all the intermediate steps, you have to build a flexible solution. That's the only advice I can give you. Don't hard code things, don't put things in place that are unchangeable or make a lot of effort in changing them. Yeah. Also consider opportunities. It's not because the authorities haven't told you that this is what you need to do, that you can't leverage on opportunities. Yeah, they give you a fire message. Yeah, I don't exactly know in what format yet, but have a look and see what you can do with that fire message. Yeah, can you make your business processes more efficient by doing something? Yeah, of course, if you're a smaller versus a larger company, it makes a big difference. But look further than just compliance, even when you're talking about your regulators and what the regulators request you. Yeah, there are opportunities. I'm sure there are opportunities. With respect to your internal processes, don't force them, right? I mean, I think I mentioned that maybe 4 or 5 times, which actually highlights the fact that it's really one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in the projects that I've been involved with, is that it has to be a win-win solution for both. Yeah? Only if you build a win-win solution will it actually continue to work, not just short-term, but also long-term. Yeah, and of course, governance. Yeah, don't forget about your governance. I mean, that's just the previous slide that I talked about. It is something which is logical, and I think a lot of what I mentioned on the slide might seem logical. Yeah, but it is something that in the heat of the moment is a lot of forgotten. So make sure that you put enough time aside in your project plans to also talk about these things and to agree on those things also. Yeah. And then a final recommendation that I could give you, or a final recommendation that I could think about is engage an external source, right? I mean, there are enough companies, Celligence is one of them. They are out there, they have done experiences, they have worked with other companies, they've seen what worked, what didn't work, yeah, in this particular area. And essentially from that sense, they can bring a lot to your table, yeah. And you might say, well, my internal processes are unique to me as a company. But I can tell you is that there will be deviations on it, but the core process is practically the same in all companies, right? I mean, your interactions with the regulators is the same. Interactions with safety is not that much difference with clinical. Again, there will be deviations, yeah, that will have to be looked at, but definitely also learn from other departments and what other companies even have done in those implementation projects. Yeah. With that said, I want to thank you. I hope this was interesting. I hope I gave you some new ideas that you can bring to your IDMP project, some ideas. We still have a few minutes left, I believe. So with this, I want to just end here and see whether there are any specific questions that I might answer. And if I can't get to the questions on this series, I will take the time to any questions that you posted to reply them offline and make sure that you get the right answer. Okay, again, thank you for your attention, and I'm open to questions now.
So, Wim, we do have a few questions lined up. If you could join us on screen again, please.
Should be there.
Question one is, the DADI process is specific to Europe. So is there a danger that this will be different authorities? And does this mean standardization between regulators is far from happening?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I wish I could answer to that to say, no, everything will be the same. But I think reality speaking, we've seen it in the past in other areas. All the authorities will have their own little deviation of it or their own little twist to it. So being able to sit here and say, no, they will be the same is unrealistic. So when you build processes, when you build your data, when you build your solutions, I think you have to make sure that that is taken into consideration. Yeah. That those differences will be there. There could be small differences, as I said, in codeless management. It could be also see how things are being managed, but I still believe that the core of the solutions, the core of the IDMP implementation, I think will be the same by all the authorities. So really when you say, is it far from happening? No, definitely not. I think it's, as I said, it'll have to be tweaked here and there. And also if you look at what is actually happening also is, I mean, the FDA is very involved with the EMA. You have both are working on GSRS, so the reference for the standards for the substances. So the substance standards are there. So they are there. There is recently, and I forgot the name now for a second, but there are indeed new initiatives that are happening at the global level to do alignment. So really, I think the summary to it is that, will there be differences? Yes. And we've seen it in the past. We'll see it in the future also. People look at it differently. But is it far from different? I don't think so. So if you build solutions that, and if you look at the standards, you build those solutions around those standards, and you have that level of flexibility in your processes, it will actually be fairly easier to adopt to all the regulators, in my opinion. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So question two, my experience also is that awareness is needed, but do you have recommendations on what we can do to ensure this is done properly?
It's an interesting question, at the same time a very difficult question to answer, I would say, because it's of course it's really depending on how your organization works, how you are structured, yeah, to see what best works for you. So maybe we might have to look into it a little bit more details on what would work for you. What I would say, however, is that to really give some concrete examples, awareness, definitely you need to create it. And I'm not just looking within regulatory, I'm really looking at your whole organization and everybody that's involved, right? And awareness is not just a matter of training in my eyes. And if there's one thing that I've learned from trainings, because awareness and training is actually taken in synonyms sometimes, but what I did learn works. Yeah, it's a little bit more difficult to set up. It's if you do those awareness sessions, make them interactive, and more importantly, also do cross domains. Yeah. So typically, what I've seen is that you do an awareness session for safety, you do an awareness session for clinical, you do one for manufacturing, but that cross-pollination isn't there at that point in time. So what I would definitely recommend, if you do those awareness sessions, is to actually organize a few and have different people from different organizations or different departments join those sessions at the same time. And you can repeat that multiple times, because that also spares some ideas of, for instance, somebody in manufacturing could get ideas with somebody from clinical things or vice versa. Yeah? So I think that would be one recommendation that I would say. That would obviously also imply that you have to make those sessions interactive, right? So it's not just a training session, it's really an interactive session. Make sure what people think about it. See how you can actually connect different departments together also, which actually also is one of the topics for next week's session. But make sure that happens, right? It is this interactive sessions and making people from different departments talk to each other. Yeah. Now that's a matter of awareness, and I know your question was related to awareness. Yeah. But I would also look at it as a long-term project. I would not just look at it as something, oh, we'll do it once, or will be done with it. I think it also gets involvement. I would say awareness. I would also extend it to involvement. Yeah, what I mean with that is that make sure that people and I know it's primarily going to be driven from the regulatory team, this deployment, but when you set up a project, get your customers, your internal customers involved in it. Yeah, give them regular updates on what is happening. It's not just a matter of a one time, but maybe you could have a short newsletter, a monthly update of what is happening with IDMP, so that people feel engaged with it. They feel that you basically that you keep them up to date of what is happening. And in this changing world of regulations, I think it's important, especially also if you look at the EMA has done an agile approach. Yeah, so you definitely want to look into that also, is to make sure keep them aware. Yeah, and you could even extend it so far. Of course, it depends on how big your company is, but it's get them involved in the decision-making processes. Yeah, not just for their piece, but also make sure that they are aware of what is happening and they get in their say in other parts of the project that doesn't necessarily involve them. Yeah, so keep them aware of what it is, and keep them involved into business process. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to invite everybody to the steering committee. That's also not going to work, right? But for instance, regular surveys, regular questions that you might have, internal questions around certain topics, could actually also help to get people engaged and feel that they're part of this project. Yeah. So I think those are some suggestions that I would say. As I said, it's sometimes more difficult to set these things up, yeah, and to monitor them, but it keeps people engaged, keeps people being part of the project, and seeing what happens in other areas will actually help them also maybe come up with their own ideas on what could help in their area.
Great, thank you. We do have one more you might be able to answer quickly. We've got a minute or so left. Do I only need to worry about marketed products? Or what about clinical products and processes?
Yeah, it's actually quick. It's a very, very frequent question that comes up in sessions about IDMP. And if you really look at what the EMA is doing, there's a lot of focus in the EMA on the marketed products. Yeah? Won't go into, I don't have enough time, I see. Won't go into details around why that is. Yeah, but it's the market is driven towards thinking about marketed products primarily because of the EMA having the SPORE project in that area. And also now the DADI project is also heading into that direction, but it isn't. Yeah, and the short answer in my last minute that I've got left is you do also worry about the clinical products, because clinical products will become marketed products over time. You want to make sure that the data that you collect for those clinical products can actually flow into marketed products, that your processes flow into those marketed products very easily going forward. Yeah. So I do believe, so the short answer really is yes, look at those also. Yeah, keep them into consideration, because keep in mind also is when you're looking at the ISO-IDMP standards, yeah, if you have a chance to look at those details, yes, the EMA is driving primarily towards EMA, or the EMA is driving primarily towards marketed product, but the ISO standards actually also involve clinical products, right? There's a whole chapter into those ISO standards that talks about clinical products. Yeah. So it definitely does make sense to keep those in mind also when you're developing and when you're defining the projects and the processes around IDMP.